The words hung in the air of the too large kitchen, sterile and heavy. "I want a divorce." Elias watched Naima's face, searching for the reaction he expected, the one he deserved. He had rehearsed this moment in the hollows of his mind for weeks. He anticipated anger, a flash of betrayal in her intelligent eyes. He braced for the sharp, cutting retort of a woman whose world was built on contracts and consequences. He was even prepared for relief, a quiet exhalation that would confirm what he already believed, that their strange, fragile marriage was a burden she was ready to shed. He was a weight, a working-class repairman tethered to a titan of industry, and this was the moment he would finally cut the rope, setting her free and proving himself right. It was a test, a cruel and desperate one, designed to shatter the illusion he could no longer bear to live inside. Naima stood by the marble island, her briefcase still in her hand, the tailored lines of her navy blue suit a stark contrast to the domestic setting she never quite seemed to inhabit. She did not flinch. Her deep brown skin, usually luminous even under the harsh recessed lighting, seemed to absorb the shock without reflecting it. She simply held his gaze, her expression not one of anger or relief, but of a profound and weary sadness that felt ancient. The silence stretched, filled only by the hum of the stainless steel refrigerator and the frantic thumping of Elias's own heart. When she finally spoke, her voice was not the clipped, commanding tone she used in boardrooms. It was a whisper, a sound so soft it almost buckled the air around it. "Okay, Elias." He blinked. That wasn't the script. She set her briefcase down with deliberate, silent care. "If that's what you need to feel safe again." She looked around the cavernous kitchen, at the gleaming, unused appliances, the stark white walls. Her eyes weren't seeing the luxury, they were seeing the emptiness. Then, her gaze returned to him, and it was filled with a concern so genuine it felt like a physical blow. "But where will you and Amara go?" The question struck him with the force of a physical impact. Not, "Get out." Not, "My lawyers will be in touch." Not even, "How could you?" Her first thought was not of herself, not of the insult, not of their broken pact. Her first thought was of him and his daughter, of their safety, of their future. In that single, selfless question, she had dismantled his entire pathetic test, exposing it not as a position of strength, but as an act of profound self-sabotage. She saw past his ugly words to the fear cowering beneath them. The strength drained from his legs. The floor, cold and unforgiving, rushed up to meet him. Elias, a man who had buried his first love, who worked with his hands and prided himself on his quiet resilience, fell to his knees. A sob, thick and ragged, tore from his throat, the first one he had allowed himself since the day Lena died. He was not cutting a rope. He was trying to saw off his own lifeline. And she was holding on, her grip gentle but unbreakable, refusing to let him fall. Days passed. The word divorce was never spoken again. It became a ghost that haunted the edges of their conversations, a shared trauma they silently agreed to ignore. Naima moved around him with a new, heartbreaking tenderness, as if he were made of spun glass. She would leave a cup of ginger tea on his workbench in the garage, the steam fragrant and warm. She would ask about his day, not with the polite detachment of a housemate, but with a focused intensity, her eyes searching his for the truth. Elias, in turn, retreated further into himself, shame a constant, bitter taste in his mouth. He had shown her the ugliest part of his soul, and instead of recoiling, she had offered him grace. He didn't know how to live with that. His life had been split in two by Lena's death. The first part was a life of color, of easy laughter and the comfortable mess of a love that had grown since high school. Lena was sunlight and music. Her death from a sudden, aggressive cancer had not just been a loss, it had been an amputation. The world went gray. The second part of his life was survival mode. It was him and his daughter, Amara, a tiny, bright star in an endless night sky. Amara, with her mother's eyes and a spirit that refused to be dimmed. She was 5, and she was his reason for breathing. Elias was a good man, a quietly noble father. He worked as a senior IT specialist at a massive tech conglomerate, a job that was stable but invisible. He was tall, with dark brown skin, and hands that were calloused from fixing not just servers, but leaky faucets and broken toys. He wore his clothes, simple button-downs and work pants, pressed and clean, a small act of dignity in a life that often felt overwhelming. He was a black man in his early 30s, a widower navigating a world that wasn't built for single fathers carrying silent grief. He never asked for help. His kindness was reflexive. He held doors, offered his seat on the bus, and spoke to everyone, from the janitor to the executives, with the same quiet respect. He channeled his pain into being a better father, a fortress of patience and love for the little girl who was his entire world. Amara was an innocent oracle, a tiny girl with her natural hair in beautiful twists, often adorned with colorful beads that clicked softly when she bounced, which was almost always. Her eyes were bright, with a precocious wisdom. She spoke in long, breathless sentences, full of tangents and the unfiltered observations that only a child can make. She would ask the questions everyone else was too afraid to voice. She was the emotional engine of their small, two-person universe, her laughter the only sound that could pierce Elias's gray fog. Her existence was a constant, vibrant reminder of the love he had lost, but also the love he still had. They lived in a small, two-bedroom apartment in a historically black neighborhood of Baltimore, a place filled with the sounds and smells of community, but the walls of their own home were quiet, holding a space of shared loss. Naima existed in a different stratosphere. She was Naima Dubois, the CEO of the company where Elias worked, a guarded powerhouse. She was a black woman in her late 30s, her beauty regal and luminous. She wore her elegant locks pulled back in a neat bun, a style that was both professional and an unapologetic statement of her identity. Her world was one of glass towers, board meetings, and tailored suits that cost more than Elias's monthly rent. She commanded billion-dollar deals with a calm, precise authority that left rivals scrambling. Her reputation was that of an ice queen, brilliant and untouchable. But privately, Naima was starving. Her sprawling, minimalist house in the suburbs was a monument to her success and her isolation. It was silent, sterile, and lonely. She had been raised by parents who saw love as a transaction, affection a reward for achievement. She had climbed to the very top, sacrificing everything personal along the way, only to find the air up there was thin and cold. Her backstory wound was a quiet one. She had never, not once in her life, been loved without conditions. She had never known the messy, unconditional warmth of a real family. She saw the world through a pane of reinforced glass, observing human connection, but never truly feeling it. She saw Elias in the corporate hallways, a quiet man who carried himself with a dignity that had nothing to do with his station. She saw the picture of the little girl with beaded braids taped to his computer monitor, and she felt a pang of something she couldn't name, a yearning for the authentic, uncurated life he seemed to represent. Their worlds were never supposed to collide, but one rainy Tuesday, they did. Elias got a call from Amara's school. She had a high fever and was asking for him. His heart seized with that specific terror every single parent knows. He promised he'd be there in 20 minutes, grabbing his keys and jacket. But his old sedan, parked in the corporate garage, wouldn't start. The engine just clicked, a pathetic, final sound. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at his throat. He was on the phone with a tow truck company, his voice tight with desperation, when a quiet presence registered beside him. It was Naima. She had been walking to her own car, a sleek black luxury sedan that hummed with quiet power. She'd overheard his frantic, one-sided conversation. "Is everything all right, Mr. Kane?" she asked, her voice even and professional. Elias was so flustered he could barely form a sentence. "My daughter, she's sick. My car." He gestured helplessly at the dead vehicle. Naima didn't hesitate. The Ice Queen persona dissolved in an instant, replaced by something soft and humane. "Get in," she said, not as a request, but as a gentle command. "I'll drive you." The ride to the school was a blur of awkward silence and the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers. Elias sat stiffly in the plush leather passenger seat, overwhelmed by the sheer strangeness of the situation. The CEO of his company was driving him to pick up his sick child. When they arrived, he rushed inside. Naima waited. She saw him emerge minutes later, a small, feverish girl wrapped in his arms, her head buried in his neck. She watched as he buckled the sleepy child into the back seat, his large, dark hands infinitely gentle, his voice a low, soothing murmur. For the first time in years, a crack appeared in Naima's carefully constructed composure. She was witnessing an act of pure, unconditional love, and it was more breathtaking than any skyline view from her corner office. That single act of kindness became a fragile bridge between their two worlds. Amara's fever turned into a week-long flu, and Elias's car needed a new transmission he couldn't afford. He was on the verge of being evicted, a secret shame he'd been carrying for months. He was out of options, the gray fog threatening to swallow him whole. One evening, Naima called him. It was a professional call, she said, but her voice was hesitant. She had a proposal. She framed it like a business deal, the only language she was truly comfortable with. She had a large, empty house. He and his daughter needed a stable home. She proposed a marriage of convenience, a legal arrangement that would provide him with security and a safe place for Amara to grow up. In exchange, she asked for nothing. The unspoken truth hung between them. She was buying the one thing her money couldn't get her, the feeling of a family. Elias was stunned. It was insane. It was a lifeline. He thought of Amara, of her having her own room, a backyard to play in, the stability he was failing to provide. His pride warred with his paternal love, and love won. He agreed, not for himself, but for his daughter. They were married a week later in a sterile courthouse ceremony. There were no guests, no flowers, no joy. It was a transaction. Moving into Naima's house felt like moving onto a movie set. It was beautiful, architectural, and completely devoid of life. Amara was the first splash of color in that monochrome world. She ran through the long, echoing hallways, her laughter bouncing off the cold marble floors. She left a trail of crayons, picture books, and stuffed animals in her wake, slowly and surely claiming the space as her own. The first few weeks were a study in awkwardness. They were a family on paper, but strangers in reality. They ate dinner together at a massive dining table, the space between them feeling like a canyon. Elias, used to a life of making do, felt clumsy and out of place. Naima, used to solitude, didn't know how to navigate the small, intimate chaos of family life. The change came, as it always did, through Amara. One evening, she found Naima in her home office, staring at a spreadsheet, her face illuminated by the cold blue light of the screen. Amara tiptoed in, holding a piece of construction paper. "I made this for you," she announced, her voice full of ceremony. Naima looked up, startled. She took the drawing. It was a child's masterpiece of stick figures. On the left was a tall figure drawn with a brown crayon. "That's Daddy," Amara explained, pointing. In the middle was a small figure, also brown, with wild beaded braids. "That's me." On the right was another figure, tall and elegant, drawn with the same brown crayon, wearing a bright purple dress. "And that's you." Beneath the figures, Amara had written their names in wobbly letters. Elias, Amara, Naima. Naima stared at the drawing. 3 brown-skinned figures holding hands under a giant smiling yellow sun. A simple, profound declaration. A 5-year-old had drawn them as a family. She had seen what the adults could not yet admit. A single tear escaped and traced a path down Naima's cheek. Amara's little face scrunched up in concern. "Why are you crying like me when I miss Mommy Lena?" she asked, her voice soft. The innocent question broke something open in Naima. She was crying because for the first time, someone had included her in the circle of family without her having to earn it. She was crying because this little girl, who had every right to resent her, had instead offered her a place. "They're happy tears, sweet girl," she whispered, her voice thick. She pulled Amara into a hug, burying her face in the child's hair that smelled of coconut oil and innocence. It was the most honest human contact she'd had in a decade. That drawing became the new foundation. The ice didn't just crack, it began to melt. Naima started leaving work earlier. She would sit on the floor with Amara, her tailored suit pants getting wrinkled, as they built elaborate towers out of blocks. She learned that Amara was obsessed with butterflies and could name 3 different kinds. One Saturday morning, Elias decided to try and make a real family breakfast. He was not a gifted cook. The pancakes were a disaster. Some were burnt, others were gooey in the middle. He was about to throw them out in frustration when Naima walked into the kitchen, wrapped in a simple silk robe, her locks loose around her shoulders. She looked softer, more vulnerable than he had ever seen her. She looked at the plate of misshapen pancakes and smiled. A real smile, not the polite corporate one he was used to. It reached her eyes, making them crinkle at the corners. Then she laughed. A genuine, warm, musical laugh. "They're perfect," she said. She picked up the most burnt one, slathered it in syrup, and took a big bite. Delicious. The sound of her laughter was like the first day of spring after a long, hard winter. It was a light, warm moment, a flicker of domestic comedy in their strange, constructed life. Elias found himself smiling back, the knot of tension in his chest loosening just a little. He watched her eat the terrible pancake with sincere enjoyment, and in that small, absurd act of kindness, he saw the woman beneath the CEO. The woman who was so starved for simple, imperfect moments of connection that she would declare a burnt pancake a gourmet meal. The bonding continued in a series of quiet, domestic scenes. Elias, discovering a loose hinge on a kitchen cabinet, took out his tools and fixed it. It was a small thing, but the house felt a little more lived in, a little more his. Naima, in turn, started a small garden in the backyard, planting butterfly bushes for Amara. She and Amara would spend hours out there, their hands in the dirt. Naima's elegant fingers, usually tapping on a keyboard, now gently patting soil around a new seedling. One evening, after Amara was asleep, they sat on the back porch, a rare, comfortable silence between them. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. "She looks so much like her mother," Elias said quietly, breaking the silence. It was the first time he had mentioned Lena to Naima. Naima didn't offer platitudes, she just listened. "Her smile," Elias continued, his voice thick with memory. "It's pure Lena. Sometimes I look at her and it hurts. But it's a good hurt. It reminds me that the love was real." Naima turned to him, her eyes soft in the twilight. "My parents, they loved my achievements," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They were proud of my grades, my promotions, the name on my door. I don't think they ever knew how to just love me, the person." It was a shared wound. His, a love lost. Hers, a love never truly found. They sat in the gathering dark, 2 lonely souls from different worlds, their respective pains laid bare between them. No solutions were offered, no easy comforts given. There was only a shared silence, a mutual recognition of the scars they both carried. In that quiet moment on the porch, their marriage of convenience began to feel like something else entirely. It began to feel like solace. But the world they had tried to keep at bay could not be ignored forever. Their unconventional marriage was a secret, but secrets have a way of getting out in the corporate world. The antagonist was a man named Marcus Thorne, a slick, ambitious executive on Naima's board who had always coveted her position. He saw her marriage to a low-level employee not as a personal matter, but as a strategic weakness. He began to whisper in the right ears, planting seeds of doubt about Naima's judgment. Was she emotionally unstable? Was she being manipulated? The whispers grew into a quiet campaign. An anonymous photographer, likely hired by Marcus, began to follow them. Photos appeared in a notorious gossip blog. Naima, the titan of tech, pushing a little girl on a swing in a public park. Elias, in his work clothes, carrying groceries into her mansion. The narrative was clear and cruel. The Ice Queen had cracked, her personal life a chaotic mess that called her leadership into question. The pressure mounted. The board grew nervous. Shareholders were asking questions. The world Naima had commanded with such precision was starting to fray at the edges, and Elias knew, with a sickening certainty, that he was the cause. He saw the strain in her face, the the way she held her shoulders a little tighter, the return of the guarded look in her eyes. The warmth they had started to build was being chilled by the cold winds of her other life. He started to believe Marcus's narrative himself. He was a liability. He was dragging her down. The immense class difference between them, which had softened in the quiet moments of domesticity, now felt like an unbridgeable chasm. He was a janitor in the palace of the queen. His love for her, a feeling he was only just beginning to admit to himself, felt like a betrayal of her future. He believed that to save her, he had to cut himself out of her life. This fear, this profound insecurity, this misguided sense of noble sacrifice, this was the fertile ground in which his terrible test had taken root. He had convinced himself that the kindest thing he could do was to force her to let him go, to confirm that he was nothing more than a temporary project, an unfortunate footnote in her biography. He had needed to hear her say it, to validate the ugly voice in his head that told him he was unworthy. And so, he had stood in that kitchen and uttered the most destructive words he could think of. I want a divorce. He had expected it to be an ending, but Naima's reply, where will you and Amara go, had turned it into a beginning. It revealed the truth he had been too blind to see. She was not holding on to him out of pity or as a project. She was holding on because somewhere along the way, in the midst of burnt pancakes and butterfly bushes and crayon drawings, they had become her family. She was choosing them. The external threat, however, was not gone. Marcus, emboldened by the public chatter, formally requested a board meeting to review Naima's leadership and assess potential risks to the company's stability. It was a corporate coup, thinly veiled in procedural language. The meeting was set for a Friday. The week leading up to it was thick with tension. Naima was a ghost in her own home, constantly on the phone with her lawyers, her face a mask of controlled stress. She and Elias barely spoke, the space between them once again vast and cold, filled with the unspoken fear of what was to come. He felt her pulling away, putting the armor back on, piece by piece. He was terrified he was losing her, just as he was finally realizing how much he loved her. The morning of the board meeting, Naima left before the sun was up, dressed in a suit that looked like armor, her face pale but resolute. Elias watched her go, a feeling of helplessness washing over him. He was the cause of this storm, yet he was powerless to stop it. He went to wake Amara for school. She was sitting up in bed, working on another drawing. "Daddy, is Naima mad at us?" she asked, her lower lip trembling. Children are barometers of the soul. She could feel the pressure drop in the house. "No, baby girl, never," Elias said, sitting on the edge of her bed. "She just has a very hard day at work." "This is for her," Amara said, holding up the drawing. "To make her brave." Elias took it. It was another family portrait, but this one was different. The three brown-skinned figures were standing together, but the Naima figure was in the center, taller than the others. She was wearing a golden crown. The Amara figure was holding her hand, and the Elias figure had his hand on her shoulder. Above them, Amara had drawn a swarm of what looked like angry black scribbles. "Those are the scary monsters at her work," she explained. "But they can't get her. Because we're her team." We're her team. The words hit Elias with the force of revelation. He had been so focused on being a liability that he had forgotten he could also be a strength. He wasn't just the janitor in her palace. He was her husband. He was Amara's father. He was part of her team. Quiet certainty settled over him. He knew what he had to do. He dropped Amara off at school, the precious drawing carefully placed on the passenger seat. He then drove not to his own job, but to the gleaming glass tower of Naima's corporate headquarters. He wasn't dressed for it. He was in his usual work pants and a simple gray sweater. He didn't have an appointment, but he walked into that lobby with a purpose he hadn't felt in years. He was not there to fight. He was not there to make a scene. He was there to stand with his wife. The boardroom was a chamber of cold hostility. Naima sat at the head of a long, polished table, a lone figure under the glare of fluorescent lights. Marcus Thorne was leading the attack, his voice smooth and venomous as he detailed the reputational damage and lapses in judgment. He spoke of brand identity and shareholder confidence, using corporate jargon to mask a deeply personal and misogynistic attack. Naima remained poised, her hands clasped on the table, her face an unreadable mask. But Elias, who had learned to read the subtle language of her posture, could see the tension in her shoulders, the faint tremor in her clasped hands. Just as Marcus was winding up for his final, killing blow, the boardroom doors opened. Every head turned. Elias stood in the doorway. He wasn't supposed to be there. He was a complete breach of protocol. Security guards started to move toward him. "Let him stay," Naima said, her voice clear and steady. The guards stopped. Elias walked slowly, deliberately into the room. He felt a dozen pairs of judgmental eyes on him, sizing up his simple clothes, his non-corporate presence. He ignored them all. His eyes were only on Naima. He walked to her side, and without a word, he placed his hand on her shoulder, just as Amara had drawn it. He then laid the child's drawing on the polished table in front of her. A murmur went through the room. Marcus sneered. "What is this, a kindergarten art project?" Naima looked down at the drawing. She saw the three figures, the golden crown, the protective stance. She saw the angry scribbles held at bay. She saw, "We're her team." A new strength flowed into her, warm and solid. She looked up, and the mask was gone. Her face was open, vulnerable, and more powerful than any corporate facade she had ever worn. She rose to her feet. "Mr. Thorne is right," she began, her voice ringing with a new clarity. "This is not a stock report. It is not a projection of quarterly earnings. It is a document of value. You all sit here and you talk about assets and liabilities. You measure worth in market share and profit margins." She picked up the drawing, holding it for them all to see. "For years, I have measured my own worth by your metrics. I have built this company. I have delivered record profits. I have lived and breathed for the approval of this board. And I have done it alone." Her gaze swept across the room, landing on Marcus with icy precision. "You see my husband, my family, as a liability. You see this," she gestured with the drawing, "as a weakness. You are mistaken. This is the single greatest asset I have ever acquired. It is a reminder that true wealth is not something you can quantify on a balance sheet. It is loyalty. It is love. It is having a team." She looked at Elias, her eyes full of a love so fierce it silenced the entire room. "I have spent my entire life building an empire of glass and steel. And my husband, this man you dismiss, has spent his life building a home out of love and resilience. My daughter, whose drawing you mock, has more wisdom in her little finger than this entire board combined. She knows what matters." Naima laid the drawing back on the table. "You have a choice to make. You can have the CEO who delivers profits while her soul starves, or you can have the woman who has finally learned what it means to be truly wealthy. But you cannot have one without the other. My family is not a liability. They are my board of directors. They are my strength. And if you cannot see the value in that, then you are not fit to be a part of this company's future. Because I am choosing them. I am choosing this." She took Elias's hand, her fingers intertwining with his. It was a declaration more powerful than any resignation. It was a reclaiming of her life. The room was utterly silent, the petty power of Marcus Thorne shriveling under the weight of her authentic courage. She had not been defeated. She had won, not by playing their game, but by refusing to play it at all. They walked out of that boardroom hand in hand, leaving the stunned silence behind them. They didn't speak on the elevator ride down. They didn't need to. The air between them was charged, not with tension, but with a new, profound intimacy. They had faced the storm together and come out the other side. No longer two separate entities bound by a contract, but a single, unified front. When they got home, the house was quiet. Amara was still at school. The afternoon sun spilled through the large windows, casting golden rays across the floor where Naima had once cried over a child's drawing. She turned to Elias, her eyes searching his. "Thank you," she whispered. "We're her team," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He gently touched her cheek, his calloused thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "Naima, when I said what I said, in the kitchen, I was a fool. I was scared. I felt like I was poison to you, that I was ruining everything you'd built." "Elias," she said, her own tears welling, "don't you see? You weren't ruining it. You were saving me from it. I had a full portfolio and an empty life. You and Amara, you filled the emptiness." He finally let himself believe it. He finally let himself accept the love she was so freely offering. He leaned in and kissed her, a real kiss, not of passion, but of deep, soulful recognition. It was a kiss of homecoming. It sealed the promise that had been made in a boardroom and born from a child's drawing. The divorce was not just a forgotten word. It was an impossibility, a relic from a life they had now left behind forever. They had found their way back, not to the beginning, but to a place far more real and resilient, a place called home. Weeks turned into a few months. The fallout from the board meeting had been swift. Marcus Thorne was quietly forced into early retirement. Several other board members, shamed and inspired by Naima's stand, offered their unequivocal support. Her position was more secure than ever, but her relationship to it had fundamentally changed. She delegated more. She left work at 5. She discovered the joy of weekends. Her work was no longer her identity. It was what she did. Her identity was here, in this house that was no longer sterile, but filled with the vibrant, beautiful clutter of life. One bright Saturday morning, the air was warm and smelled of cut grass. Elias was in the backyard, watching Amara, now 6, run giggling through the spray of a sprinkler. Her beaded braids, newly done by a neighbor Naima now called Auntie Carol, swung in glittering arcs, casting tiny rainbows in the mist. Naima came to stand beside him, a mug of coffee in her hands. She had on an old t-shirt and shorts, her feet were bare, and she looked more beautiful to him than she ever had in her designer suits. He came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. She leaned back against him, a perfect fit. They stood there for a long moment, just watching their daughter play, the picture of domestic peace. "I'm so glad you didn't let me go," he whispered into her hair, the memory of that awful day in the kitchen a distant, faded scar. "There was never a chance of that," she murmured, covering his hands with her own. "You were already home. You just didn't know it yet." Amara, dripping and laughing, ran up to them, clutching a new, slightly damp drawing. "Look!" she exclaimed, her face beaming. "It's our forever family!" She held it up for them to see. It was their most detailed portrait yet. 3 brown-skinned figures stood holding hands under a bright yellow sun that had rays stretching to every corner of the page. The Elias figure was smiling, the Amara figure was laughing, and the Naima figure, wearing her golden crown, was looking at them both, her face full of love. Naima took the drawing, her eyes shining. She looked from the crayon figures to the man holding her, to the child beaming before her. This was her real portfolio. This was her greatest merger. It wasn't a life she had planned or acquired. It was a life she had chosen, and that had, in turn, chosen her. And the narrator might say that in the end, family is not about blood or contracts. It is a quiet decision made every day to show up, to be present, to offer grace when it's least deserved. It is built in the spaces between words, in the sharing of a burnt pancake, in the mending of a broken hinge, in the courage to stand together when the world tries to tear you apart. Love is not something you find when you are perfect. It is something that finds you in your brokenness, and with breathtaking patience, helps you put the pieces back together. It is the profound and life-altering gift of being truly seen, not for what you have or what you do, but for who you are. And for Elias and Naima, it was the beginning of forever.